Thank you for your presentation, but I have to tell you that I vehemently disagree with what you said. And basically, I want to point out that the original document, the Constitution, which you tell us is the blueprint for us, has actually been completely ignored, which is why we have the current crisis that you're talking about. I agree with that, okay? But the constitutional blueprint is nothing like the police state we now live in, okay? That is the problem. We left the blueprint a long time ago, right? Now everything is regulated. Everything has a law, thousands of laws. We can't possibly all be happy and agree on all these laws. That's the problem.
I don't terribly disagree with you. Part of what you're saying is also one of the reasons why so many of those constitutional amendments, once you pass number 10, are about clarifying the Constitution itself, about procedural things like how to hold elections and how to pick the president. And it's remarkable how many of those amendments are cleanups to the original Constitution, and that just speaks to the vagueness of the blueprint. But I don't terribly disagree with what you said.
Essentially, I agree with the constructs of what you're saying, but I believe, from my own point of view, it's too limited a container to look at democracy in, because democracy is a living, breathing thing, as Atticus Finch said in To Kill a Mockingbird. And if you look at the world as a Pangea, it is constantly falling apart and coming together. I believe, in the strictest sense and the great ideal of democracy, it is strongest today than it's ever been. You can look at Germany. In fact, we are, as a world and as human beings, trying to redefine ourselves because of what? The leaks, the creaking, the hurt that democracy is demanding of us as human beings. And if you look at us as human beings as animals with language, because that's really all we are, and democracy, Congress, all these words we've come up with, they're words. And as Abraham Lincoln said, basically, sentiment rules, okay? And if you just put us in that limited capital democracy word container, it's not going to work, but it is working. Look what happened in World War II in Germany. Step into Germany today. Democracy is alive in so many ways in Germany. Democracy, because of the blueprint we created in this miracle, we had a black president. And when Trump took office, they interviewed this black woman on NPR, and she goes, "How is it for you?" And she said, "Honey, I'm used to it." Because we're walking in your shoes today. We're walking in so many people's shoes today. So yes, Reconstruction, 4 things in a mule, we never got it. They took away all the bankers and the blacks in the South, but it's working. And it's going to continue to work. It may not be here, but it's working all over the world. And all our partners that Trump has made us look like, or him, as a pariah and a fool. But on the other hand, they're looking and saying, well, maybe we understand what it is, okay? But we do understand what it means in this country. There will be more black presidents. There will be more women, because we've weathered many storms, and I believe we will continue to.
Given the recent rollover into the new flock contract in Troy, I'm sure you guys are aware of it. It's heavily being protested. There's a protest tomorrow in Troy at City Hall against it, and I was wondering if Dr. Blackmon?
Yep.
Yes.
Dr. Blackmon, if you could give some historical context to connect the current, camera, CCTV sort of flock camera police state in Troy to the history?
I don't, I'm a kind of have mixed views personally about any number of these applications of technology in terms of public safety or whatever. I mean, I've thought for years that when the day came, I didn't figure it would come anytime soon, but that when the day came that, well, for instance, that one of the solutions to police violence when a traffic stop goes goes off the rails, that raises the question of, well, what if we use technology to that if you were speeding at any time on any sort of highway, that it just automatically either the information from a computer inside your car or from a device outside that you just automatically got a ticket or a charge from the state for going over the speed limit. I oftentimes will ask students about that scenario. What would you think of that? And so it would eliminate, I don't know, 80% of traffic stop encounters between citizens and police, and thereby probably eliminate a whole lot of things that go haywire in terrible events. And so maybe that's the solution. Now, the response I usually get to that is, well, no, that would be terrible, either from a civil liberty perspective or from a, oh, I don't know, I just kind of like to, that we Americans still have some wild in it somehow. We just don't like the idea of a constant surveillance dimension. We have a sense of a right to privacy that that we should be able to escape the constant eye of government somehow at times. And I get that too. And I know that in Atlanta, when it hasn't happened to me, but I've had acquaintances, I guess I live in Atlanta, that it was sort of a miracle to me a few years ago, the first time that somebody I knew had a car stolen, and the next day the police brought the car back to them, and it turned out that because of the first generation of these cameras, that I was sort of shocked to realize that the Atlanta police, were able to pick up on almost any vehicle moving around the city at any given time. And on the one hand, it's like, wow, you can get your car back. On the other hand, that's a sort of terrifying constant eye. So I have kind of mixed views about it, except to the degree that it's something that the American people need to decide. This should be something that, again, what constraints there are going to be on enforcement of the law and on the powers of the police in this regard, like all those other regards I talked about, needs to be determined by a thorough, open, honest, candid dialogue among the American people or among the specific residents of a particular jurisdiction.
I would like to comment on that also. Big Brother is Big Brother. And I watch what's going on in China, and they started there, and it expanded to the point where there is no such thing as privacy. Everyone's picture and ID and identification is known. I just believe that we've opened the Pandora's box, and we're not really prepared for the consequences of what's coming from that. It may seem good initially, some of the positive things that may arise from it, but inevitably, when things have happened, for instance, when we have had cameras and sought the information from cameras for specific things, interestingly, the cameras were not working. So who has charge over that? Who has control over that? Certainly not the people. So we don't necessarily and won't necessarily be able to get what we're looking for. So for my own personal feeling, I am concerned about Big Brother. And I think we should all give serious consideration.
The first two reconstructions that we had failed. They did not succeed. And we did not straighten out things in the 70s after the 60s. And that was made very clear when we watched the murder of George Floyd by a white policeman on television in 2020? Is that when that happened? The same year, Heather Cox Richardson came out with a book, and when I saw the title of the book on my computer screen, I knew I was woke. And that's a word now you can't use anymore. But the title of the book was How the South Won the Civil War. And we just have a whole lot of unfinished business to straighten out in this country. And now it's becoming clear to many of us that the Constitution was really written to protect the enslavers and not lead in any way to the end of that. So the police, my last comment, the history of the police in this country is basically to protect the enslavers and to round up escaped slaves. That's where our police departments came from. In other parts of the world, there were armies that were called on when there were disruptions, but you did not have police forces. That was true in Ireland, where my ancestors came from also. And so I have lived in small towns in America where there were no police. If something bad happened, you called the county sheriff. And yeah, you have to have some kind of law and order of that sort. But the cameras in Troy are probably overkill.
I hope it came through that when I talked about each of those reconstructions and asked, did it work or did it not? I think the answer on all of those was that it worked for some, but not for all, and some variations in proportion of that. And I, of all people, would agree with you that the Reconstruction after the Civil War did not have the intended effect, since I, the evangelist of the idea that slavery continued for another 70 years into the 20th century. And so, no, I completely agree with you that at no point along the way have we achieved, have any of those reconstructions been fully effective, including in the 70s, it's just that was when, as I said, that's the first moment in time that you can even make an argument that there is some sort of meaningful, broad access to these levers of achievement and economic success, educational attainment, open to some version of a fuller spectrum of all the American people. And when that finally happened, it's extraordinary what people achieved, once given even that limited access to it. But I do think that in that period of time was the closest we've come, and I can't name an exact moment that I'm talking about, but I think in that era we came the closest to, for the first time, having a broadly shared idea in America that, we all agree that except for the bad racists over there and the neo-Nazis over there, that there's some core agreement among a fairly broad range of Americans with somewhat differing political perspectives that nobody should be kept away from voting, just to serve one side or the other. And everybody the laws should be applied equally to everyone. And there should be, and it's not until the 1960s that there are the first Supreme Court rulings that really speak to the illegality or legality of police conduct in particular, in specific situations. And so we did finally arrive at an era where there were these there were more broadly shared cornerstones of how this society might work than there had been at any point before. But it still wasn't sufficient. I completely agree on that. And I think that, as I say, Donald Trump is not the crisis, and he's not the maker of this moment. I think he is the exploiter of this moment. I think that something else, failures in our society, opened a door that then was going to allow a Donald Trump or somebody else to exploit that. And that's still evidence of the failure of those reconstructions. I would agree with you about that, even though there were some successes for some parties along the way.
Certainly one of the crises of today is a collective powerlessness and a collective feeling of powerlessness among the voter base. How do you energize people when they feel like all of the systems have failed them. There's no path forward. There's no one who can fight for them, no one who can represent them and make their wishes come true.
That perspective is wrong. That perspective is wrong. I understand completely where it comes from, and I fight some of those same feelings inside myself. But we do have that power. In fact, one of the most, and this begins to sound more political, more explicitly political, and I don't really exactly, I mean, that's okay, I don't mind that, but a lot of what I've tried to talk about tonight, I think really is not even a right versus left equation, but this begins to sound more political, but that in this particular moment, one of the most remarkable things is that all of the macro trends of American life suggest the opposite. Suggest that what's happening right now in terms of that, one, I mean, even if we just think of politics in the simplest racial sorts of terms, the number of white people in America is declining. The number of old white people in America is declining fast. Where that's why NPR is going down, or PBS is going down the tubes. A big part of my career. And meanwhile, this much more diverse, younger population of Americans is what's on the rise. And I mean, I think a very substantial part of why this kind of longer crisis that has been developing, that came to this moment, a big part of what that has been all about is that, and one reason why one end of the political spectrum has been willing to engage in behavior that even they 20 years ago would have said would be abominable behavior. There's been a willingness to engage in these anti-democratic efforts because that's a constituency that sees the end, that sees the mathematical inevitability, not of white people. We're going to be around for a while yet, but there's a mathematical inevitability in the sense of that this is a society that is overwhelmingly moving toward broader and broader consensus around the importance of a diverse population of people and a broad range of ideas, a broad range of ways that people can live their lives and what gender they want to be, who they want to love, how that all works. Everything says that's where the heart and soul of the majority of the American people are moving. And there's another group of people who, many of whom may actually even agree with a lot of that, but who realize that the one path to retaining power in an equation in which power is rapidly evaporating, the one path is to incite terror about those macro changes toward diversity, towards pluralism. And I think that's absolutely the reason that we have seen a willingness on the part of people who might once have seemed like, respectable players on the other side of the equation, but a willingness to engage in despicable anti-democratic behavior, to say despicable things, to say things that not long ago were completely outside the boundaries of what we would have considered civil conversation or even decent conversation. And so, but what that tells me is that we're in this weird moment where the side that is actually has far more power, far more energy, far more destiny baked into its numbers and baked into the trends, has become somewhat sort of persuaded that it has less power than it does. And so I think that power is there. We have electoral challenges, but those would be solved by young people don't like hearing, just go vote. But it's kind of true, that if we would all vote, that would make a big difference. But there we go, thank you. But also, and my old colleagues, the Wall Street Journal, if they hear this, will come after me or make crazy claims about me. But, people act like that at the No Kings marches when some people were talking about things like a national strike or whatever, and people acted like that was, praying to the devil or something. I don't know, this sort of madness. But if the majority of Americans believe something badly enough that they really want a government that they feel like they cannot control anymore to stop doing, then they should all just refuse to go to work the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. The people have a power and a scale that is immeasurable. That doesn't mean if they're willing to be shot down in the streets. I'm not even talking about getting to that point. If the majority of the American people agree with that idea, then that would be an incredibly effective thing. And that is something that happened in American politics over and over again in other eras. That's not a crazy foreign idea. So that would be my real answer, is that power is there. We just have to be brave enough to exercise it. And that includes me.
Thank you. Dr. Blackmon, I guess this is more of a personal question. I was surprised to see in your bio that you were a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, and you were bureau chief. I didn't say what bureau. And I would think you were more of a New York Times kind of journalist. So
That's my sworn enemy.
So I'm just kind of curious as to what your evolvement, or if there has been any, since your time at the Wall Street Journal and the involvement of your teachings and your political discourse from then until now.
Well, sure. When I am out in public talking about the book, Slavery by Another Name, which I wrote while I was still at the Wall Street Journal, and I would often get a version of this question, and it would usually basically boil down to, why would a white guy like you, who working for Rupert Murdoch at the most conservative news organization in America, though Fox News already existed by then too, why would you write that book? And so your question is a version of that. And the simple answer to that is that I wasn't on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I was, and on the news page of the Wall Street Journal, particularly in the time that I was there, it was the most rigorously fact-based news reporting on its news pages of, and this is a superlative statement, but I'll stick to it, of any publication in the English language anywhere in the world. It was the most reliable in its news stories of any publication in the world, including more so than the New York Times. And I said they were my archenemy, and we were tremendous rivals on the news pages, though I greatly respect all sorts of friends at the New York Times. And the Wall Street Journal today isn't quite what it was then, but it's still a quality newspaper on its news pages. On its editorial pages, its opinion pages, it's madness. It used to be a kind of intellectual madness. Now it's just madness. Like Fox News is trivialized madness. But your more substantive question about my evolution is, first I would say watch my film The Harvest, because it's kind of all about that, and all about the town that I grew up in with my dad, who has 3 appearances in that film. You hear his voice 3 times in that film. But The Harvest is the story of the little town that I grew up in Mississippi, and I started the first grade in the fall of 1970. And there was no kindergarten in Mississippi in public schools then. And so I started the first grade in 1970, and my class was the first in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade, black and white together, and go all 12 grades. And so that group that graduated in 1982 in many school systems in Mississippi and other places in the South was the first to have a fully integrated 12 years of public education. And that happened by coincidence to be the coincidence as far as me to be in that class. Now, much less coincidence on the part of my dad and my mom, to have made the decision that most white families did not, to keep their kids in public schools, including my 2 older brothers at that time. And so The Harvest, that film, is really my kind of personal exploration of kind of the question you were asking, how did this come to be? But also, why did this thing that was so profound, such an incredibly important event in American history, to finally bring an end to mandatory segregation, that finally came to an end? But why was it that we then failed as a society to replace that with successful, diverse, multi-ethnic kinds of public educational experiences? And even more so, why did all that lead to the attack on public education that continues today? I mean, public education is hanging by a thread. I mean, I think there's actually fairly remote possibility that public education for my grandchildren, if they ever come along, that will be a presumption of the existence of public education anymore. And certainly in many states across the country, the attack on public education, which all began, again, with when that moment in time when finally black people in America were able to say, hey, shouldn't all that stuff apply to us too, including public education? And that's the moment that all of a sudden what had been maybe the most universally shared idea in all of American thought of public education as the bedrock of democracy, that public education was where we all learned that we're all the same, whether we're rich or poor, but just not we're all the same, whether we're black or white. But when it finally becomes, no, it's also black and white, then all of a sudden public education is no longer a foundational element of American life, particularly in those places where there are a lot of different kinds of people. And so that film really is about my experience, my classmates, and the sort of our getting to know each other, what we learned about ourselves, but it's also about the whole society. The bottom line answer to your question was, for whatever reason, even as a kid, growing up in the leftover vestiges of segregation as it's finally breaking apart, but that even as a kid, for whatever reason, I observed at a really early age, whenever I looked around, that there were just a lot more obstacles in the paths of the black kids that I knew than in the white kids I knew. And I didn't understand that. And I've spent, it sounds flamboyant or dramatic or something, but I can't even explain it, but I've spent my whole life trying to answer why was that? Why is that? How can that be in a just society? How can it be that I'm born over here and all these obstacles are not in front of me, but Donald Richardson is born a few blocks away and all those obstacles are in his path? Why is that? It can't be right. It can't be right, particularly in a society that claims to believe the things that we do. And so that's been my curse or my blessing, to have to pursue that all my life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.